Conservatives call for reforms to Canada's asylum and immigration system despite several proposed amendments being rejected as a committee-led study on Bill C-12 came to an end.
The Alberta independence movement scored a critical victory during the United Conservative Party's annual general meeting over the weekend, with 5 pro-separatist candidates winning seats on the party's board of directors.
Conservatives urge Prime Minister Mark Carney's government to come clean on the Veterans Services Liberals' plan to cut as $4.23 billion in, quote, savings from Veterans Affairs Canada was earmarked in the 2025 federal budget. Hello Canada, it's Monday, December 1st, and this is the True North Daily Brief. I'm Isaac Lamoureux.
And I'm Walid Tamtam.
We've got you covered with all the news you need to know. Let's discuss the top stories of the day and the True North exclusives you won't hear anywhere else. Conservative MPs are urging the federal government to adopt what they call, quote, common sense reforms to Canada's asylum and immigration system after a series of proposed amendments to Bill C-12 were rejected at a committee this week. The House of Commons Public Safety Committee concluded its consideration in the committee phase on Friday. In response, Conservative immigration critic Michelle Rempel-Garner said the Liberal government has, quote, destroyed the immigration consensus by allowing backlogs to grow, permitting bogus applications, and relying on courts to resolve problems. Rempel-Garner said the number of temporary residents, now more than 3 million, has placed, quote, overwhelming pressure on healthcare, housing, and youth employment, while leaving newcomers who followed the rules stuck waiting in the queue. Conservatives proposed amendments they argued would deter fraudulent asylum claims, strengthen removal rules for non-citizens who commit crimes, and increase reporting requirements so, quote, Canadians can judge the system for themselves. Liberal and Bloc Québécois members defeated most of the amendments. Among the rejected proposals were automatic removal for non-citizens convicted of certain offences, terminating asylum claims if applicants leave Canada, consequences for post-secondary institutions that facilitate false asylum claims, and measures requiring claimants to prove they filed promptly. So, Walid, a lot of the Conservatives' proposed sweeping amendments were rejected, but which of the Conservatives' amendments to Bill C-12 passed, and what could that mean if passed in Parliament?
Well, Isaac, unfortunately, many of the amendments offered by the Conservative critic for immigration and the Conservative Party was rejected, of course, and actually majority of them was rejected. And among those were some rather common sense proposals around automatic removal for non-citizens convicted of certain offenses, terminating asylum claims if applicants leave Canada, and consequences for post-secondary institutions that would facilitate false asylum claims, and measures requiring claimants to prove that they filed promptly. So those were all measures that were rejected, of course, and removed. However, there were some, as you mentioned, that were passed, and that includes the automatic termination of a claim when an asylum seeker voluntarily returns to their own home country, mandatory warrants for individuals considered national security risks, and the end of claims where a person is found inadmissible to Canada. So if this bill continues the process of becoming law, of course, these are some of the Conservative amendments that have received cross-party support. Of course, something else that got cross-party support in this bill was a new monthly report to Parliament detailing deportations, an expanded annual report listing federal benefits provided to refugee claimants, and of course the number of removal orders enforced within 30 days and the reason for the delays in the cases of delays. So essentially, Parliament will be producing a lot more fact-finding missions where we'll have better ideas in the public sphere of how many deportations are being done, and of course a bit more details around refugee claimants, and that's going to be something very important for us to be reporting on in the near future. But if this is passed, you will all see some reforms that will make it a little bit harder for certain individuals to claim refuge if they voluntarily return to their own country, and of course, if they are deemed to be national security risks. Now, of course, that term is rather ambiguous in today's language. However, it seems that the security element of our immigration system on the refugee asylum seekers proportion will be a little bit more constrained and a bit more strict. And of course, the ending of claims where a person is found admissible may just be the biggest move in this series of amendments, simply because, as we know, when people have failed to renew student visas, temporary work visas, obviously refugee pathway has always been the one of last ditch opportunity for many individuals coming to Canada and wanting to stay no matter what the law says. I guess this might be an area of clear improvement to lower the backlog for the future years. But of course, the system still remains strained as we speak today. The last event for the Alberta UCP AGM on Saturday was perhaps the most vital for the party, as the results for the board election came through and saw the separatists win some positions on the board of directors. However, separatist advocates did not sweep the election, failing to elect their candidates to some key positions, including the board president. The Alberta Prosperity Project promoted a list of board candidates for separatist advocates to vote for. The list went position by position, highlighting candidates deemed, quote, pro-Alberta independence. An alternative list of, quote, pro-establishment candidates who separatists said supported the status quo was also provided. The list read, quote, this voting guide highlights candidates who support Alberta independence, Alberta first values, and grassroots accountability. All voting decisions remain your responsibility. The Alberta Separatists endorsed 9 candidates for the position of President, Secretary, VP of Fundraising, VP of Communications, and various riding positions. 5 candidates advocated for by the Alberta Prosperity Project won, while 3 won for the establishment. The Edmonton candidate who won was on neither side of the Alberta Prosperity Project's list. So, Isaac, you were there at the ground at the AGM. What does this mean for the Alberta independence movement, and how will this change the UCP party?
Yeah, Walid, this is super interesting. I think this could change the party in a pretty notable way. We know that Alberta Premier Danielle Smith's messaging, and therefore as a byproduct, the party's, has been continuously anti-separation, instead advocating for a sovereign Alberta within a united Canada. When I first wrote this article, as the results were just announced, the results for the VP of fundraising were so close that they had to do a recount, which wasn't officially told at the AGM, so I had to look today. But as it stood at the time, the separatists had 4 candidates win, while the establishment had 3. One of the candidates, as you said, was on neither side of the list provided by the Alberta Prosperity Project, so we'll call them a neutral candidate. But when I checked the updated list today, it turns out the candidate that was deemed to be pro-separation won the VP of fundraising position, meaning the separatists have 5 out of the 9 candidates, a slim majority, against the 3 that were pro-establishment. And of course, when I talked to General Counsel for the Alberta Prosperity Project, Jeffrey Rath, at the AGM, he was hopeful that they would establish a majority on the board. This was just before the results came in, and that was accomplished. So I think the separatists are probably pretty happy with the results, despite not having their preferred candidate win at the president role, which may be the most important. As for what this means going forward, I don't entirely know, but I am very, very interested to monitor whether this alters the party's messaging in any way at all, and if they become more pro-separation going forward. The influence of those newly elected board members matters, because the UCP board controls everything from constituency association oversight to candidate approvals. Separatist advocates were explicit that their goal was to shape future nominations, select MLAs, and determine the party's direction leading into the next election cycle. Now that a slim majority of pro-separatists govern the board, it would suggest that those conversations cannot be simply sidelined by party leadership. The broader consequence is that the independence question will now be structurally embedded in every major internal discussion, even though Danielle Smith used her keynote speech to reaffirm her opposition to leaving Canada and celebrated the new Memorandum of Understanding with Ottawa as a victory on issues like electricity regulation and emissions caps. The presence of separatists on the board guarantees that these policies will be evaluated potentially through a more critical lens. Every step she takes in implementing the MOU or verifying Ottawa's compliance with it will unfold with a board that includes people who openly believe the agreement is a mistake. So with the board seat secured, separatist organizations now have potential procedural leverage, something they have not held yet inside a governing party. Conservatives are demanding the Carney government disclose which Veterans Affairs services will be cut to meet the $4.23 billion in savings earmarked in the 2025 federal budget. Conservative MPs, many of whom are veterans themselves, demanded answers from the Liberal government. They said many veterans are concerned that the 15% budget cut to Veterans Affairs Canada in the federal budget will leave them without critical services owed to them for serving Canada. Prime Minister Mark Carney's first budget explained that the $4.23 billion in cuts to VAC would come from a reduction in the amount Canada pays to reimburse medical cannabis costs for veterans. Instead of reimbursing veterans at a rate of $8.50 per gram, the government would transition to paying $6 per gram to meet market price. The plan says it will cut $1.2 billion from the budget in 2026-27, followed by another $1.2 billion cut the next year and $1.06 billion in the third year. According to Veterans Affairs Canada, the medical marijuana reimbursement program cost nearly $245 million in 2024-25, leaving Canadians in the dark about where the additional almost $1 billion in savings would come from in the following year. Richards questioned the figures during a press conference in Ottawa on Thursday.
The math doesn't add up for me on that one. We're talking about a $245 million a year program. We're talking about a $2.50 reduction in the reimbursement rate. The math just doesn't add up on that one. The department itself claims that, and the minister have claimed that 90% of their budget provides benefits and services to veterans. Their budget is less than $7 billion. They're cutting $1 billion from that. There's no way that there isn't services and benefits that are being affected here.
While answering a question from a reporter, Richards noted that Conservatives reject taking funding from veterans' services.
Would a Conservative government reinstate these cuts? And to be clear, would it reinstate the $2.50 a gram reimbursement?
Well, the first thing is we actually don't know what the cuts are. For starters, that's the first thing in here is we actually need to determine what they actually are. But what we believe and what we would stand firmly on is that this is a government that's got a $78 billion deficit. They've made actually very few cuts, but the one place where they decide to cut deep is on the men and women who have served this country, who have sacrificed for this country. That is the last place that you should start when it comes to cuts.
Veterans Affairs Canada deferred True North's request for comment to the Department of Finance, which was not immediately available. So Walid, Richards mentioned the poor track record Liberals have had when dealing with veterans and the CAF altogether. What are some of the grievances Conservatives have with this government on the file?
Well, Isaac, in recent years, Conservatives have raised a few issues, such as offering assisted suicide to veterans that are seeking help, something that Veterans Affairs Canada officials were caught doing in multiple cases. They've also mentioned how the government has failed to address veterans' homelessness, leaving major gaps in federal support programs, attempting to stop providing wreaths for Remembrance Day ceremonies. Of course, we heard about a cut to wreaths provided to MPs and other public officials. Also, the banning of chaplains from praying at Remembrance Day events. This is part of Canada's anti-Christian regime, element of trying to purge the country's history and heritage from any resemblance of its Christian nature. A decade-long failure to build a national monument to Canada's mission in Afghanistan. So to this day, that has not happened under the last nearly 10 years of Liberal governance, and persistent disability claim backlogs at Veterans Affairs Canada, which veteran groups have warned could worsen if staff positions are cut. So again, all of these concerns were actually explicitly listed by Richards in his press conference.
That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. You can stay on top of new episodes every weekday by subscribing to the Daily Brief on iTunes and Spotify. Also, while you're at it, make sure to hit us with a 5-star rating and please leave a review.